All rise. Face the flag, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Steve Plummer, would you return thanks, please?
I will. Holy God, we are here today to enjoy the fellowship with each other, to enjoy the friendship. We thank you for the visitors that we have and the enlightenment they will give us, share with us today. We ask you to bless this food to the nourishment of our bodies and us to thy service. Amen.
Kiwanis is a global organization of volunteers dedicated to improving the world, one child and one community at a time. Have a seat, please. We want to welcome everybody here today. A special welcome to our program's mother. Would you like to introduce?
I do. This is Ann McCormick, my mother. I'm talking about my vacation today, and I'd refused to tell her anything about it, so she said she was going to come to this program.
Welcome. Our newest member by transfer is Ms. Amy Johnson. We are ecstatic that she is one of us now officially, and she has brought a guest. Please introduce your guest.
This is Caitlin. She's a friend and the newest team member that I have at Counseling Services at Campbell University.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Bobby, Boys and Girls Club Golf Tournament.
Yes, October the 5th, Boys and Girls Golf Tournament here at Keith Hills. We're looking players and we're looking sponsors. If anybody would like to participate in the golf tournament, we've got quite a few of our members already pledged and are going to play. But anybody else that wants to be a whole sponsor and play, we'd love to have you. October the 5th.
October the 5th. Anything else for Kiwanis? It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Duncan McCormick.
That's a nice introduction, nice warm welcome. I feel kind of like it offended after they read the charges aloud. The judge looked at him and said, "How do you plead?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. I haven't heard the evidence yet." John called me or texted me a few weeks ago, asked if I did the program today, and I got excited and told him, I'd just been in a bunch of training relating to amendments to the rules of civil procedure and the rules of general practice relating to the new e-filing requirements in North Carolina, and I was excited about that. He kind of gave me a blank look and said, "Well, how about that trip to France?" And so Betsy and I just got back from France. We were mostly in southern France, Toulouse, the Canal du Midi, Avignon, and then a couple of days in Paris. And so what I thought I'd talk about is what I'd never heard of before I went, which was the Canal du Midi. And our self-driven canal boat trip during 1 week in southern France. I had never heard of it. Our friends from Chapel Hill, a couple friends, came up with the idea. 6 people on a boat. You didn't need a license to drive. You could just drive it yourself. They'd give you a little training. And, we planned a lot for this. We did a lot of planning, a lot of destinations. We didn't really think about the fact that none of us were boaters. And I feel a little bit like that football coach in Johnson County a few years ago. Had a really tight football game. Coming into the end of the game with about 3 minutes to go, the other team punted, and his team ended up with the ball on their own 2-yard line, 98 yards from the end zone. He was struggling because his defense had been great. His defense had been great all day. Solid, hadn't allowed any scores, but his special teams have been horrible. 3 block punts, including the only touchdown scored by the other team, and they're nursing a 2-point lead. So he called his quarterback over and he said, "Parker, 3 plays. 3 plays, no huddle offense, no time in between plays. I just want you to hit it quick. First play, hand it to the fullback, run it up the middle. Second play, hand it off to our tailback, run it up the middle. Now the third play, this is what I want you to do. You're going to take that snap, you're going to take 3 steps back, and I want you to punt that ball as far as you can." First play, they handed it to the fullback. Straight up the middle, the secondary parted, He went all the way to the 50-yard line, home crowd cheers. Second play, handed it to the tailback, swung around the end, all the way down to the 5-yard line, home crowd cheers. Third play, Parker takes the snap, goes 3 steps back and punts that ball as far as he can. It heads all the way out of that high school stadium, across the road, lands in somebody's yard. Home crowd stunned. Quarterback trots over to the coach, who's just fuming. He grabs him and he looks at him and he says, "Parker, what the heck were you thinking?" Parker doesn't respond. He says, "Parker, what the heck were you thinking when you punted that ball on the 5-yard line?" Parker said, "What was I thinking?" He said, "Yes, what were you thinking?" He was thinking. I said, "Well, I was thinking, man, we got a dumb coach." So on that first day, on that first day on the Canal du Midi, the 6 of us are in that boat. We had one person who was a very experienced sailor, one person who'd driven a motorboat a little bit. These are fairly big boats, kind of like an RV, hard to handle. And we're kind of going around in circles when we're supposed to be going straight into a lock. And I'm thinking, man, one of us probably should have thought about learning how to drive a boat before we go. Let me tell you a little bit about the Canal du Midi and get you oriented. The Canal du Midi is in southern France, and it's part of a canal system that links the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. The half near Bordeaux connects up to a different canal, which goes on to the Atlantic. From Toulouse, which is the 4th largest city in France in the south, the canal runs about 150 miles to the Mediterranean. It was built in the 1680s. And so it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's one of the oldest operating canals in the world. And I tried to get an idea on who had done this thing before. And it's very, very popular with British tourists, a lot of boaters. We saw a lot of Germans. But I wanted to know who the first American was. And I determined that it happened a long time ago, that you had at least one tourist back in 1787. And what he did was, an American, he took his carriage and he had it taken off its wheels and put on a small barge. Back in those days, you have towpaths by the canal. One thing, when you're on the canal, you see bicyclists, hikers, bikers, just constantly running these old towpaths. But then they used a horse, and the horse towed the barge. And this particular traveler was on a tour of Italy, and his name was Thomas Jefferson. You might have heard of him. He said, "Of all the methods of traveling I've ever tried, this is the pleasantest. I walk the greater part of the day along the banks of the canal, level and lined with a double row of trees which furnish shade. When fatigued, I take a seat in my carriage, where as much at his ease as if I was in my study, I read, write, and observe." And indeed he did. He wrote a lot. He took copious notes. Thomas Jefferson was interested in the workings of the canal, wrote all kinds of notes on how the canal worked. At this point, the canal is over 100 years old. It was not called the Canal du Midi then. This was before the French Revolution, and so I believe it was called the Royal Canal de Languedoc. That was that region of France where a few years later after the Revolution, anything associated with royalty got its name changed. And so it was changed a few years later to the Canal du Midi. He took a trip opposite of ours. So he started on the Mediterranean Sea and went west and north towards Toulouse. We started a little bit, several miles from Toulouse, and went the other direction. We didn't go all the way to the sea. He took notes, and apparently, even though he, as president, wasn't a fan of the Erie Canal and thought it was a crazy project, the people who built the Erie Canal used a lot of his notes on the operations, the gates. He had made notes on how he thought they could go faster, was frustrated with how long it would take to get in and out of the locks. Give you an idea of our boat. We're on a boat, we were commercially rented boats. At this point, the canal is pretty much only vacation boats. You'll see vacation boats when you're going through cities and towns. There'll be tour boats. It's kind of like a big mobile home. We had 3 berths, so 3 bedrooms. Each of them had what I'll call a bathroom. The bathroom was about this big around. It had a toilet, a sink. The sink had a thing you could pull out that would make it a shower. There were holes in the floor if you wanted to shower. Our boat was called the Brom because one of the towns on our journey was the Brom. The early frustration was getting through the locks. And there's about 65 locks on the Canal du Midi. Each of those locks requires you to get into the lock. After you get into the lock, the gate closes behind you, the lock fills with water, lifts you up or takes you down to the next level. Where we started was close to the high point. And so that's about 680 foot above sea level. We had to do a few of the locks we were going up. Most of the time we were going down. In the early part of the trip, the locks came fast and furious. So at some point we'd have a lock every 100 meters. In one town we had a lock where there were 4 locks in a chain. Toward the end, as we got closer to and were basically at the Mediterranean Sea, it was fairly level, and I think we went at one point 10 kilometers without hitting a lock. But none of us had ever gone through a lock before in a commercial boat, much less manage one ourselves. And so we had to go through training on the first day that the locoboat team gave us on what to do in the locks. And this would be an example of a lock as we'd be coming in. The difficult thing, the first day, as our drivers were having trouble, we were rotating through, and the night before, we had gotten to the lock the night before. The French are very serious about a couple things. One of them is lunch. Locks close between noon and 1. If you can't get through a lock or the series of locks by that noon break, they're not going to let you in. They're also serious about starting and closing times. So the locks don't open until 9 and they close at 7. You can sell all you want, but you can't get through a lock before 9 or after 7. And so the first night we had gotten up to a lock, we determined that we neither had the skill nor the time to get through it. And the next day we struggled. I think it took, like I said, we were going to have to get through 60 locks. It took us 2.5 hours to get through the first lock, with our first struggle just getting into the darn thing when there were other boats. So to save water, there's a drought in France. To save water, they want as many boats in that lock as possible, usually 2. We never went through 3 on a self-guided lock, but at times we did have 3 boats in the lock, and you're jammed in there. You have to get into the lock without damaging either your boat or the other boats. And I'll just pass the picture of the lock around. When you get in, we were 6. You didn't need 6 to manage the lock. When you're going up, there's just a tremendous amount of force that's being put on the boat after they close the gates. In the first half, these were self-operated locks, so you would have one person on shore or 2 people on shore who would hit a button that would open the gate. Your boat would go in, you'd then hit another button that closed the gate and would cause the cycle. You had to negotiate with people going the other way. But at those particular locks, you had to make your own decisions. But still, the rules were to try to get as many boats in the locks as you could to save money, and that meant to save water. And that meant that the other thing we had to do was get training not only on driving the boat, but on what to do in the locks. Mooring up to the locks, there's a bollard. You had to make sure that the ropes were such that they would slip because your boat was going to go up or down. We usually had 2 people outside off the boat at the lock, 2 people on the boat who were one manning the front ropes, one manning the second, and we worked it as a team like that, usually 5 people with one of us sort of off duty. But we met a lot of other people who were far more skilled. And the first day, as we were struggling, our friends the night before had walked into town and met a German couple. And they were coming the other way. And instead of 6, they were 2. And their boat, even though it was 2, was bigger than ours. We met a ton of German and Swiss couples. They were French, but particularly German. And they just managed this as 2 people. One person would drive the boat, toss the ropes, and the other person would just fling them back to them, and they'd handle it all at once. Well, this couple took pity on us. And after they got through the lot, they came back, and Tom, the husband, got on the boat with our driver and gave them tips on what to do. These boats are very, very slow. The maximum speed is about 6 miles per hour. And in the lock, you can't move. So you have to learn to use the thrusters and little things to move these things about in currents that you can't see. And he helped our drivers while his wife, Christine, stood on the shore with us at the locks and taught us how to manage the ropes, when we needed to double wrap them, when we needed to keep them loose, and all that sort of thing. And after we got that kind of training, after that, the locks went fairly smoothly. The local boat was great, but their training was 30 minutes, and it was basically, we got to get to the next boat, move on. This is a picture of one of the locks. Going down, we never saw current. I guess the water was rushing out. It would have been dangerous to fall into. When we were coming up, it was like being in Niagara Falls. And this is just Betsy at one of the locks manning the ropes.
The width of this river or canal was that the first picture you sent by? Is that, I mean,
That would be accurate. That was at a local boat facility, and there was some variation. But for the most part, two boats could easily cross each other the width of the canal. There were frequently boats that would be moored to either side. And so you could probably have 3 boats abreast. Most of the boats were our size. There were a few. The maximum length of a boat on that canal is 30 meters because the locks are about 30 meters. So any longer than that, they simply can't get in and out. Ours would have been the size of a big RV, 24, 30 feet. Not very manageable, but at the same time, easy enough to go past other boats. This is in another lock. I've got friends wearing bike helmets. We had a couple bikes that we rent. We would go out on the bikes during the day, just kind of ride on the towpath. Bikes easily could go faster than the boats. They had hopped on the boat after doing shore duty and were in their helmets. And what they're doing, we had a couple of, you obviously end up a lot of times running into things, trying to avoid other boats. And so usually we had a couple people at the front of the boat as we were leaving locks, coming through the bridges, trying to not do too much damage. And we did pretty good. I think our fine at the end, we had left a $500 deposit, and euros and the dollar were 1-to-1. So I'm just going to use dollars. I guess they were charging us in euros. But I think our fine was $49 for a couple of those fenders that we had flattened. Despite that, we were cruising along. I think the last day, we'd gotten very comfortable and everything was moving smoothly. And I think I decided to go down and take a nap. And so I'm down in our bedroom, and the boat is cruising, and Frank, who's a friend of ours, who my wife would describe as being gung-ho, he's driving, and he was going a little too fast, and the fishermen on the bridge started yelling at him. I suppose in French to slow down, and Frank got distracted, ended up crashing right into the bridge. And so we did pull a little bit of that bumper off, and we had to do a little fast times like at Ridgemont High, kind of, we can repair it, and they didn't charge us for the bumper. This is the boat from a bike on the canalway. Give you an idea of our bedroom. We had 3 bedrooms, all were tight. The bed was such that my feet hung off the end. We had enough room so that one of us could be in it at a time if we weren't both in bed. But after a day on the river, it was on the canal. It was fairly easy to go to sleep. We had, I guess, 7 nights on the river. We were there on the canal from Monday to the following Monday. We slept, Thomas Jefferson, he always was at bed and breakfast. There were plenty of places. Southern France is more rural than the Paris area, obviously, but there were bed and breakfasts, hotels. Towns were always within walking distance, even when we didn't make our destination. So a couple days we fell short and ended up a mile or so outside of town, and friends would sometimes take a bike or just walk into town. Other days we'd be at a marina. We like marinas because they sometimes had off-boat bathrooms, off-boat showers, laundry facilities, and we could fill our tanks up with water. We were told the water was potable, but we asked the guy when he was doing our training, and he said, yes, it's potable. He goes, but I wouldn't drink it. So our grocery store runs were mainly coming back with massive amounts of water. We were able to stay at a few places. I didn't bring a lot of pictures of those. The main highlight of the boat trip is Carcassonne, which is a medieval city. Also, it's a walled medieval city. We were able to stay at a marina, and within 50 yards there were restaurants and those sorts of things. So it was a very nice place. We were there for a couple nights. It's a walled city with kilometers of ramparts. And I've been in castles before in England and Scotland, but never one where you could walk and walk and walk and walk and never leave the ramparts. And this is a picture, I think, taken from the boat on our way out on the final evening in Carcassonne. But it was the highlight of the boat tour. Like Thomas Jefferson, after the boat, we ended up in Avignon, which was an old city where in the 1300s, we think of King Henry VIII having his issues with the popes. French king had issues with the popes, ended up having one killed, installed his own guy as the pope, and that guy said, I'd rather stay in France than go back to Rome. And so the popes were based out of Avignon for about 80 years in the early 1300s. And that was within a train ride of the ancient Roman aqueducts at Pont de Gard, another place that Thomas Jefferson visited on his tour of Italy in southern France in 1787. I'm not going to go into Paris much, except that I have one picture that I was fascinated with at the Pantheon, and this is Saint Denis. If you can't see him, Denis was a 3rd century Christian and a martyr, later sainted. And legend has it that he, after the Romans couldn't get him to shut up, they chopped his head off. And he allegedly then reached down and picked his head up and walked for miles and miles and continued preaching. I think Steve said this makes him the patron saint of Baptist preachers and lawyers. And so I would like to keep on talking, but with that, I'm going to close and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Thanks. Fantastic. Thank you. Was this your first trip to France?
This was my first trip to France. Everybody else in my group had been to France before, but it was my first trip.
So did y'all take turns in your group driving, or did you have a designated
We
driver?
had 2 drivers. So we had one lady from Cary. We had 3 couples, and she was an experienced sailor, and she ended up doing about half the real driving. And then a friend of ours from Chapel Hill, the couple that came up with the idea, had a friend who did it. He had driven the boat before. They ended up doing most of the driving. Betsy and Lorraine did some driving, but in terms of in the locks, it was mostly Deanna and Frank.
How far ahead had you planned this trip?
About a year ago, our friends called us up, and they'd had a neighbor who had done this exact same trip, and he brought her over, and she was in her 70s, and said it was easy and we could all do it. And so, and pitched it to us because it was really very economical. I think the boat for the week was about $1,800, so $600 a couple. Because of the value of the euro right now to the dollar, this was a much more economical trip than we expected, even in Paris and other places. But the boat itself meant that it was less than $100 a night per couple on the boat. And I think that included the gas. We got the all-inclusive package. At the end of it, we come into one of the local boat facilities, had a little marina or port, and we spent the last night there. And the next morning we see people getting vacuum cleaners, because you could save a little money by doing the cleanup and swabbing the deck and vacuuming the bedrooms yourself. We did the all-inclusive package. If there was something someone else would do for us, we had them do it. But it was the boat was just very economical, and of course because we were staying on the boat, that was our hotel room for the week.
So it was a one-way trip. I mean, you got to the Mediterranean, and that was the end.
Yeah, we didn't go all the way to the Mediterranean, so we stopped at, and you can do anything you want. So you don't have to rent a boat. People had their own boats. We saw sailboats that were with the sails down under motor. There were a good number of people who appeared to live in, houseboats and barges and that sort of thing. And so it's an open waterway that, in theory, you could go from the Mediterranean, get on the other canal, and then go all the way to the Atlantic. I'd say most of the people we saw were either in boats rented from the company that we used or rented from one of their competitors. And I think someone who we talked to who had done a lot of these types of things said he always chose the company based on where you started and ended. So if you're renting, you need to start where they've got a facility with a bunch of boats and end where they've got a bunch of boats. But we didn't go all the way to the Mediterranean. There would have been some, a part of the stretch we didn't do had one of the big aqueducts where you're the aqueduct. So the canal is about 6 feet deep, 2 meters deep. And there's periods where it goes over roads, so we went over roads, and we're the bridge. The canal is the bridge, and there's one that goes over the River Orbe that's fairly famous. I think it dates to the 1800s. Early on, they didn't have all the infrastructure they did later.
So these locks are 6 feet deep when they're not.
The canal is 6 feet deep. Now, the locks varied in size depending on how much they're going. So there would be times in which if we were in the boat, and the boat is, I don't know, 10 feet tall from there to there, certainly taller than me, where I was standing on the roof and I'm below the lock. So the locks, I think, could be 3-4 meters high, and when filled would have that much water in them. It just depended on how much they needed to lift you. I'm not sure what their maximum height was. There was in Castle Denary, I think, just short of Carcassonne, there was a set where we went through 4 locks, and those locks were not as steep as some of the ones where we were just going through a single lock, but those varied in size. So the lock might be very, very deep, depending on how much they were moving you in or out. And I'd say usually at least 5 to 6 feet, and more often 10 feet or more.
And you flew in where?
I flew into Toulouse. I think all of us, we went in 3 groups, so I was the last person in. Betsy had gone over earlier, and Frank and Lorraine and Betsy went in the first group on a Wednesday. I think our other friends went over on a Thursday. I couldn't get out of town till Friday. And so I came in separately, flew through Heathrow and then on to Toulouse. I think all of them flew through Paris into Toulouse. And Toulouse is a fantastic town. I just didn't get much time there. The rest of them got 3 days, but it's a 4th largest city in France. It's a college town. I came in at about midnight, and they arranged for a taxi for me, and I thought the town would be dead. As I'm coming in, there's just hordes of people on either side of a very small road. It was very much like New Orleans and Greek week at a university mixed up, just all kinds of young people. We went out to a river where they had a pedestrian bridge, and you had 500, 600 people along the banks of the river. I think you may have seen the photo I had of the public facility that would allow a man who needed to use the bathroom to do it in an unconventional way, but very young place.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
There's something for your cupboard at home. And anything else for the good Kiwanis? Thank you to our guests for being here.